Alright guys, welcome back. In our last video, we were looking at some causes of the French Revolution, the overspending, the bad winter, the unequal free estates model, all those factors, high price of bread, whatever you want to list. Now we're actually going to take the French Revolution and kind of move it to the next level. So we got a violent beginning with the storming of the Bastille in 1789. Now we're going to move out a little bit further and describe how the French Revolution changed French society. So before we get into any more details, let's think about the French Revolution going forward, and let's think back to our three estates model. So in your first estate, we had the clergy. In the second estate, we had the nobility. And the third estate was basically everybody else, middle class, lower class, peasants, poor, everybody. So what would the first estate have to gain in this revolution? Not much of anything. They were already at the top of society. What would they have to lose? Pretty much everything. What would the second estate have to gain? Not much of anything. They were already, again, pretty much the top of society. What would they have to lose in this revolution? And pretty much everything. And then your third estate, what would they have to gain? Well, freedom, equality, fairness, you name it. All the things that they didn't have before. And what do they have to lose? Not really anything. They're already at the bottom of society anyways. So that tells us the third estate is really going to be the driving force behind the French Revolution. Now, the slogan of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I think we all know what liberty is. We all know what equality means, but you're maybe not as familiar with the term fraternity. And fraternity means brotherhood. And it's kind of idea that we're all in this together. We're all part of the same family, the French family, of people, and we're all going to be working towards a better life together. All right, main idea number one, the French Revolution was inspired by the Enlightenment. So this brings us back to our last lesson. We were talking about the tennis court oath earlier and how the people of the National Assembly met and they refused to leave until they had been given a constitution, a fair constitution. Well, a constitution is something that takes a long time to write. You can't just do it overnight. So in the meantime, as a sort of almost like proto-constitution, the French are going to draw this thing called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It was written by the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, the Marquis de Lafayette is a very, very interesting character. It's a name you probably have heard about before simply because of his connection to American history. He was one of these European officers who came over to America during our revolution, helped train our soldiers, and as a young man, he had served as an advisor to George Washington. So he was a beloved figure in American history, and then he was also a beloved figure in French history. And this Declaration of the Rights of Man really kind of lays out what the French Revolution is all about. This is what we want to accomplish in this French Revolution. A couple of points to keep in mind with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Number one, all men were created equal. All men were born equal and remain equal before the law, it tells us. Second, it has built in some guarantees. You can think of this as basically a Bill of Rights, because that's what this really is. It's freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. So all the things you think about for the American the American Bill of Rights, we're going to see that in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Declaration of the Rights of Man also lists explicitly natural rights. Now, we've used that term several times before. Remember, natural rights are rights given to you by the Creator. It cannot be given by a government. It can only be protected by a government. And your natural rights, according to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, would be liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. So you have a right to fight back against oppression. Now, I love the iconography here in this image. We've got the Declaration of the Rights of Man right here, and on the left, it's kind of the before the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Everything was unpleasant, awful, right? Lightning bolts, people being crushed. And then the right, it's kind of the after effect. Everyone's happy, it's sunshiny, they're literally dancing around. It's a great time. All right, main idea number two. Louis XVI and the royal family lived in fear of the Third Estate, for sure. So our first event under this main idea is going to be the Women's March. And you can see an image from the Women's March right here. And what does this image imply about the Women's March? What does it imply? Well, it implies to me they're pretty angry, and they're also well armed, and there's a sense of purpose. They're doing something. They're marching somewhere for a reason. Where are they marching? Well, the background is after a couple months into the French Revolution, things had not really improved very much. Again, the people of Paris were hungry. They were still tired and confused and afraid. And a group of Parisian women decided that they had had enough, and they decided to storm the Palace of Versailles. They decided to go to Versailles and basically tell the royal family that they had to listen to the people. They had to do something to address the people's concerns. Now, it's during this march that Marie Antoinette famously said something that she didn't actually say. When the people arrive at the gates of Versailles, she's told by the guards that the people are outside demanding bread. And Marie Antoinette supposedly said, "Bread? Let them eat cake." And that quote was supposed to show just how out of touch she was, that she didn't understand why they're screaming about bread when they can have all these other delicacies that she has. She didn't understand that the people of France didn't have those things. So it's supposed to show how out of touch she was. Turns out she didn't actually say that, but it's a quote that kind of stuck with her anyways. Now, as a consequence of the Women's March, the royal family is basically taken almost prisoner. You can see them in their carriage there, and you can see the women marching back. They're taken back to Paris, and they're going to be living, under suspicion and under observation. And the royal family would never go back to Versailles ever again. Now, before you feel really sorry for the royal family, they are just simply trading one royal palace for another. So instead of living in Versailles, they're going to be living in this palace called the Tuileries. And, it's still a palace. They still have servants. It's not that bad. All right, Louis's failed escape. So think back to what a divine right absolute monarch is. It's a king or queen that has total power, and they believe their power came directly from God. Therefore, everything they do is pretty much guaranteed to be right. Is this what Louis XVI was by this point in the French Revolution? The answer, of course, is no. He was definitely not. And by 1791, we're looking now about 2 years into the Revolution, Louis decides that he has to break out. He's got to get away from France. His goal is to get outside the country, meet up with other people who had fled the revolution as well, maybe build up an army, maybe even get some support from other countries, and then come back and get his power back. Now, Louis was able to make it almost to the French border before being captured, but the fact that he was captured meant he was seen as a traitor. This is a man who had tried to escape and tried to undo the revolution. Therefore, he could not be trusted going forward. And now, when the royal family returns to Paris, it's not just as virtual prisoners. It is basically as prisoners. All right, our third main idea. Political rivalries and factions developed as the French Revolution unfolded. So, at this point, France begins moving away from monarchy and toward becoming a republic, which begs the question, what is a republic? And a republic is simply a government in which the people rule themselves and they're not being ruled by a king or some other dictator. The people are in charge. It's at this point that some of the more radical members of the French Revolution decide that maybe a monarchy is not the best model for France any longer, that in fact it should become a republic. And there are two factions I want to mention in this context. The first is a group called the Jacobins. The Jacobins were kind of middle class. Many of them were well educated, well read. They looked up to a guy named Jean-Paul Marat. Jean-Paul Marat was this newspaper editor. He published a newspaper called The Friend of the People, and he was very radical and very pro-violence. He had basically said that anyone that supported the king should be put to death. So he's willing to really cause lots and lots of bloodshed to achieve the goal of turning France into a republic. Now, the end result for Marat himself is that people began to fear that his calls for violence would get out of control. And this is Jean-Paul Marat in his final moments. It's a famous painting by Jacques-Louis David, a famous French painter, and it shows the moment after he was stabbed. You can see the knife right there and the blood and everything like that. And what had happened was a woman named Charlotte Corday, she decided that she had to basically sacrifice herself for the French people, and by putting down this madman, who she saw as a madman anyways. So she went to his place, and she got in by convincing them that she had this list of names of potential traitors, and that's something that Jean-Paul Marat, who's always super paranoid, would have been very interested in seeing. And as they talked for about 15 minutes, she eventually pulled out the knife and plunged it into his chest, and that's the end of Jean-Paul Marat. The second faction we're going to look at is a group called the Sans-Culottes. And Sans-Culottes refers to a working class people. So this is not the Jacobins, who had been more middle class, more well-educated, people who probably would have been maybe shopkeepers or lawyers or something like that. The Sans-Culottes are very much blue-collar, salt-of-the-earth, hardworking, physical labor type people. And they also wanted a republic, and they also decided that violence was totally justified in creating that republic. And now, why are they called the Sans-Culottes? Well, the wealthier people of France, wealthier men anyways, wore these knee-length pants called culottes. So they went down to about your knee right there. This is something that the working class people would have never been able to afford. That's why their name literally means those without culottes. Okay, those without culottes. Now, another symbol you'll see often depicted in the French Revolution paintings and drawings, what have you, is this cap right here. We call this a liberty cap. And by wearing this, you would have shown your support for the French Revolution. It's a way of kind of showing it off to the people and saying, yeah, I am a revolutionary. I believe in the revolution. All right, France goes to war. Now, do you think other European monarchs would have supported or feared the French Revolution? And why would that be? Main idea number 4. Fears over the spread of the French Revolution sparked long wars across Europe. 1792, we are now 3 years into the Revolution, and France decides to declare war on Austria and Prussia because it felt that the revolution was being threatened by foreign countries. This came about as a result of some warnings countries like Austria and Prussia had thrown out there that, if you harm the royal family, if you try to invade other countries to spread the revolution by force, we will stop you. And France decides, rather than wait around to be attacked, that they would go on the offensive first and attack these foreign countries. Now, the problem for France is, this is a country that's not totally unified anyways. It's in the middle of a violent, bloody revolution, and now it's taking on major powers across Europe. So this is very much a country that's going to be stretched basically to its limits. All right, so we looked in this section about how the French Revolution was changing French society. We looked at the different factions that were rising, like the Jacobins, the Sans-Culottes. We looked at how the royal family was basically seen as traitors after they tried to escape. We saw also the fact that France went to war to try to protect and spread its revolution across Europe.